Just Zoom. Okay, we're recording. Welcome into those of you joining us on Zoom. We're gonna get started here in just a couple minutes. Let some folks filter in. But thank you so much for being here. Get it to 7:04. Quite the crowd. Certainly on Zoom. Here come my parents.
I do some.
Where did you go yesterday? What time? You said you went someplace yesterday? Sherry Samuels. Samuels.
Yeah, the guys, I wish I could go.
If I could get you over to anything like that. That's fine. Wow. Looks like they have some good something over there.
Welcome in. Watching the clock, get it to 7:04. People a little bit of a grace period, you know, people often talk about Jewish standard time. 5, 10, 15 minutes late. But it's funny, I feel like there's all different types of standard times, lots of different cultural groups.
Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome in everyone to, if you will it, just to sort of, wanted to let everyone here in person know that there are folks joining us on Zoom. So, and that the Zoom meetings will indeed be recorded. They'll just be sent out to folks that have registered in case people are able. Come on in. I'll take you away from me. Okay, no problem. And so we'll be sending out, along with the presentation, a copy of the slides. We'll be sending out a recording of the class if folks are able to make it for one or two, or not others. Just at the top, I want to say that especially we had a lot of folks registered for the course, which is really wonderful and exciting. With that said, we will have some opportunities for discussion. And I will definitely pause at moments to entertain questions and comments, but also want to make sure that we're able to cover a lot of material, because I think, and this is really where I wanted to start with, is that the key term in the title for this class, if you will it, of Brief History of Zionism, is that word brief. This is a 3-week course. It's meeting for an hour every week.
1 hours.
You know, this is a topic that, I mean, I have 2 books right here that people spend lifetime studying. And so I just want to say on the front end that we're not going to be able to cover everything. We're going to be painting in very broad strokes. But I hope that over the course of these 3 sessions that it'll give us a little bit of a grounding and a background about where this whole thing of Zionism comes from. And as I mentioned in kind of the blurb, the written information for the class, Zionism, Zionist is a term that's flown around a lot, and in particular in the past few months with the horrible events that have been taking place in Israel. And I think it's really important that we take this opportunity to define terms. Now, of course, you know, there's many different definitions, but have the opportunity to take a look back and look at where does Zionism come from? What are its principles and how did it lead into the state of Israel that we see today? And just from like a larger philosophical, historiographical, to use a very fancy academic term, question that we can ask is, oftentimes when we look back at history, we think that things are bound to happen in the way that they should, that it was almost self-evident that the state of Israel, the first time the Jews, the Jewish community, the Jewish people had a state of their own and political power and political independence in 2,000 years, that it was self-evident that it was bound to happen. But that is not the case. There are a lot of different factors that lead into historical processes. And so we're going to take a look at some of the different ways that this developed. Now, of course, if you will it, I always try to incorporate some of the content into the title. Is the first part of an expression, a phrase, for many people, really a motto that we hear oftentimes. If you will it, it is no dream, which is a phrase that comes from perhaps the figure best known and most associated as what we would most people refer to as like the father of modern day Zionism. One of the founding fathers, even though he didn't live to see the creation of the state of Israel, but is certainly seen as one of the prime innovators and organizers that led into the creation of the state of Israel, Theodor Herzl. We see this lovely photograph of him here. He lived from 1860 to 1904. Now, oftentimes we'll hear this phrase in Hebrew, im tirtzu ein zo agada, and then it continues, if you will it, it is no dream, or agada can mean legend. I've seen some people translate it as fairy tale, but it was not originally written in Hebrew. In fact, the book that it comes from is a book called Alt Neuland, which was originally written in German. Theodor Herzl being an Austrian Jew, and we're kind of fast forwarding here, so we're eventually going to get to Herzl and talk about him, but of course this book was eventually translated into Hebrew under the title of Tel Aviv. Alt Neuland means old new land, and it was translated in Hebrew to Aviv, which is a combination of the old and the new. So Aviv means something new, literally means spring. And a tel does anyone know what a tel is? Okay.
It's an
Archaeological site, exactly.
Oh,
So a
okay.
tel are usually mounds or hills that are really fruitful archaeological sites because they were the sites of towns or cities that existed and then were basically demolished, and then there was another city built on top of it, and then another city built on top of it. And so the collection of those ruins creates tells, and that's one of the big things that people study when they study biblical archaeology or ancient Near Eastern archaeology in the land of Israel. And so, of course, we know that this eventually becomes the name of what people refer to as the first Hebrew city. And we're going to talk about that distinction of the first Hebrew city. But there's so much that's happening in just this phrase. First of all, the fact that it was originally written in German and then translated into Hebrew shows that Zionism as we see it today was very much a combination of a lot of different thought processes that are happening all across, and primarily we're going to be focusing on Europe and European history. And the fact that it was translated into Hebrew, obviously now we know that Hebrew, the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language is one of these key elements of the Zionist project, but that was not a given. That was not, there were plenty of Zionists who, didn't necessarily interact with Hebrew in the same way. And then finally, this interaction between what is old and what is new. And I think that's a really good jumping off point for us, because it is a question of when you talk about the history of Zionism, where do you start? Do you start? Do you start, and in many, when people teach about Zionism, many people will start with biblical texts from the book of Genesis, with God telling Abraham, or at that point, Abram or Abram and Sarai to go forth to a land, and then proceeding from there. And of course, when we talk about history, where we start and where we end is a really, really important thing. So we're kind of starting at the end and then going back to the beginning in a lot of ways. So what is this dream that Herzl is talking about? The second part of that phrase that you'll hear in Hebrew is liot amchoshi be'aratzenu, be'eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim, which means to be a free people in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. So the idea is a dream of a state for the Jewish people in the land of Israel, the ancient homeland of the Jewish people, and this idea of freedom, which is connected with ideas of self-determination, the idea of not being beholden to other political powers, but actually claiming power for ourselves. And so back to what I was describing before, where do we start talking about Zionism? There's many different approaches to it. For this class, again, brief intro to Zionism, but also it's very much representative of the way I understand Zionism. And I think it's important to understand that while Zionism connects us with this ancient yearning and this ancient connection with the land of Israel, Zionism is very much a modern phenomenon. It's a modern movement, and it is very much, and perhaps I'm showing my hand before we actually dive into everything. It is very much the result of the processes and the ideas and the cultural shifts that came from the modern world that we all know today. And so that's really where I want to start. So let's begin here. Those of you who perhaps didn't know what you were getting into, welcome to modern European history. Of course, that's a joke. But I want to begin here. This is a lovely artistic depiction of the French Revolution. Right. Generally happened between 1789 and 1799.
Les Mis.
Les Mis. I meant to have a little clip from Les Mis.
Les Mis.
But yeah, we have, the drummers, we have the revolutionaries, and the reason why I want to start here is because the French Revolution, which in many ways, what occurred after the American Revolution, and was a huge shift in terms of greater European politics. And we have to remember that at this point in history, the vast majority of Jews are living in mostly Europe and also in the Middle East. There haven't been these huge migrations of Jews to the United States that we'll see a little bit later. But in many ways, the French Revolution and then the rise of Napoleon around the turn of the 19th century, meaning the late 1700s, early 1800s, is the onset of what we understand to be kind of the modern world that we live in. And it had a lot, obviously, of impact in terms of the political organization of Europe, and especially when it came to European Jews. So the first key term we need to kind of establish is emancipation. The idea of emancipation is really this idea of being given civil rights. That's probably how we would best understand it. And this has a lot, this is really specifically important for Jews because for a long time, and we have a whole other class about like medieval Jewish history or pre-modern Jewish history, but for a long time, Jews lived in European territories, whether it's modern day France, Germany, whatever it is, but they were very much sanctioned off as their own community, and they governed themselves, and they lived there by the tolerance or the allowance of the German, the European various monarchies, aristocracies, so on and so forth. But this
Shtetls, right?
shtetls,
Shtetls.
sure. And basically emancipation is part of this larger shift in terms of the idea of citizens of states, of certain freedoms that are allowed for people. And when we talk about emancipation, it's the giving of rights and the ability and more freedoms, I would say, to groups that have generally been minority groups, and especially for Jews. And so in August 26th of 1789, the French, I'm forgetting the technical term, but the French Association of Political Representatives, whatever it's called, approves the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which was authored by one Marquis de Lafayette. Obviously,
He
anyone.
was a friend of the United States.
Yes, he was very involved in the American Revolution. And anytime I hear,
Hamilton.
anytime I hear that, I think of Hamilton.
He's big in Hamilton.
And specifically, I want to hone in on Article 10. No one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, including his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. So this is the idea of religious freedom. That the state can't determine a person's religion, we might say religious persuasion, or how they choose to express their spirituality. And there's a debate that's happening within France, because this is really where this starts, and then this model kind of spreads across Europe of, does this apply to Jews as well?
Right.
It really what's guiding a lot of these shifts into the modern world is when you think about what's been happening in Europe over the past 100, 200 years, is these immense, terrible, bloody wars between Protestants and Catholics that's been going on, and the establishment of different states and allegiances to the Pope, rejecting the Pope, so on and so forth. And so as a result of another term that we're going to come to in a moment, the Enlightenment, maybe we're getting flashbacks to our history classes back in middle school or high school or whatever. As a result of the Enlightenment, they're saying, okay, the state, in many ways, and this is certainly the way we see it articulated in the United States, state needs to be separated from religion in some way. And we want to create what they would describe as a more tolerant society, where your civic responsibility is not determined by your religious affiliation, meaning you can be a citizen of France, of Germany, of England, of whatever it is, but also practice a religion, so you can have Catholics and Protestants and Jews and other groups that are a part of the state, but practice a different religion. And so this is a question that they're debating, a lot of these French politicians, and there's a very, very famous phrase that is given in a speech by Count I don't know a lick of French, so please don't judge my pronunciations, but Stanislas de Clermont-Tonnerre. Okay.
Sounds good.
Thank you. The Jews should be denied everything as a nation and granted everything as individuals. And if we remember about the idea of enlightenment, it is this emphasis on individual rights. Think about John Locke. Think about the Declaration of Independence, the idea of unalienable rights that are not given to a particular group, which is the way a lot of traditional societies were understood, but that each individual person has certain rights.
Right.
You know, famously, we understand that to mean life, liberty, and the pursuit of
Happiness.
happiness, which is the way it is expressed in the American Declaration of Independence,
Right.
which is a paraphrase of John Locke's declaration that inalienable rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of, does anyone know what the Lockean? Justin got it. I see him mouthing it in the
What
back.
is it?
Property.
Oh,
The pursuit of property. Doesn't sound as nice. I don't know.
Not as good.
And so eventually in September 27th, 1791, the emancipation of all Jews is declared in France. This is a huge thing. It's the first time. And basically Jews are kind of welcomed into larger society. I mean, you know, to say that Jews went from being in ghettos or shtetls and then entered into the modern world or this modern nation state in a day, a little simplistic. It's happening over the course of time. We have people like Moses Mendelssohn who's talking about the ability for Jews to participate in larger cultural events rather than just being secluded in their, you know, yeshivas, cheters, and what have you. And this is seen as a really wonderful event. So we have, I didn't include the attribution here. I think it might be in the next slide. But a French Jew, Isaac Baer, saying, "We are now, thanks to the supreme being and to the sovereignty of the nation, not only men and citizens, but Frenchmen." Of course, let's remember, these are things written a good amount of time ago, so it's all gonna be men, so on and so forth.
The French men, right?
Right, but it's this celebration of like, oh, we're not seen as other, we're not seen as something different or something foreign or even dangerous, but we're being welcomed into this really exciting and at the time innovative construction of what it means to have a nation state, and a way of collectively organizing society, not based off religious grounds and beholden to religious authority, but based off of things like the social contract and this idea of a relationship between the governed and the governors and the governed, based off of social contracts, so on and so forth. And so we get a letter to La Chronique de Paris in 1791. France is our Palestine, its mountains are our Zion, its rivers our Jordan. Let us drink the water of these sources, it is the water of liberty. And so here, even now, we are seeing, and this is really a new thing over the course of history. You know, everyone says like, oh, there's nothing new in history, but this is a very different thing where you have a bifurcation, a separation between national identity, the idea of being a part of this larger collective, and religious identity. For the vast majority of history, religious identity was connected with national identity. Whether you have the larger concept of Christendom, the idea of all being a part of the larger Christian world. In Islam, you have the idea of Ummah, which is kind of the worldwide collective of Muslims, and there's not really a distinction between religion and civic, as we would describe it, or national identity. And this was the same for Jews. We have this sense of we are not just a set of beliefs or religious practices, but we are Am Yisrael. We are the people of Israel. But here we see that going back to should be denied everything as a nation and granted everything as individuals. So we're getting this bifurcation. Okay. Want to pause? Any questions about things we've just been talking about? Comments? Thoughts? Okay. Keep moving. Take a look at my watch. Okay. Here we go. We have the same quotes that I had before. And this is a fun little piece from a newspaper Napoleon Legrand. And this is a depiction of Napoleon, who comes in the early 1800s and starts issuing reforms, granting more rights to Jews. And it was put there, it was created in, I think it says March 30th, 1806. So you see Napoleon, you see the depiction of the Jewish community with the tablets, with the menorah, so on and so forth. And this is seen as a really exciting time where Jews get to finally participate in society and culture and go to universities and have secular education and hold civic political office, which is a very new and for so many people exciting thing. And in large part as a result of this, we have this thing that begins to develop primarily in Germany called Reform Judaism. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. But of course, the term emancipation in the United States, specifically when it comes to Jews and the Jewish community, doesn't quite mean the same thing. It's very different because you don't have that history of, monarchy, aristocracy, allowing giving Jews permission to live as a secluded minority where they can govern within themselves, and there's a lot of restrictions over how much they can interact with the larger society. But from the founding of the United States, and part of what it is to be an American is this bifurcation of national identity and religious identity. And so I wanted to include this passage, very well known, written by George Washington to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. Quote, "The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, and giving it on all occasions their effectual support." And then he has this really lovely, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." A quote from the prophet Micah. "May the Father of mercies scatter light in our darkness and our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy." And so now, despite what we might hear, and that's a whole other class about understanding the United States as a Christian nation. One of the founding principles of the United States is that is the separation of church and state, and the idea that part of our national identity is inherently composite. There's many different ways of being an American. So you could be a Jewish American, we could go American Jew, Jewish American, so on and so forth. But one of the grounding principles, and largely as a result of trying to avoid all of the religious wars that ravaged Europe over the past 200 years, is okay, we're not going to have religion as part of our identity, or as part of this national project that we're seeking to build. So this piece of art actually comes from, I believe it was on a Manischewitz box for, I think it was either for Passover, I don't remember specifically, but this is actually on the tricentennial, I think, or yes, because this is depicting the first Jews who came to the United States, first Jews that ever, this is a fun fact, not necessarily related to Zionism, first Jews who ever stepped foot on this, the land that would become the United States. Does anyone know when it happened?
They say there were Jews on the Nina and Santa Maria.
Yeah, that's a little bit, we're not totally sure, but what we're definitely sure of is 1648. First Jews landed. 1648.
Say 16,
Yeah, for Portuguese Jews who came to a Dutch colony then named New Amsterdam, and then once the British took over, was then renamed to New York.
New York, yeah.
So that's what this is depicting. And so from the beginning of the United States, we have not only a sense of, oh, we can be Jews and Americans here, but a real connection with patriotism, because the idea of American identity, despite what many people may think, is not necessarily connected to religious identity. And as we'll see, that was not always the case in Europe. Even as everyone's super excited about emancipation, super excited about the Enlightenment, so on and so forth, the way it happens over the course of the 19th century is a little bit different, and it's in a lot of ways it's hard to get rid of those things when you've been part of these larger Christian kingdoms for 1400 years, 1,000 years, however you want to determine. Okay. Second key term, talked about it a little bit, enlightenment. This is this larger philosophical movement that emphasizes reason and seeks to break down a lot of the traditional structures of society. This is from this book here, Making a Modern Zionism by Shlomo Avineri. Rabbi Jeff was very kind to loan it to me. And this is a great book. If folks are really interested in this is a really, really good collection of a lot of the founding thinkers of Zionism, who we're going to be getting into a little bit next week. So Enlightenment and the reverberations of the French Revolution throughout most of Europe disrupted the equilibrium that previously existed. Secularization and liberalism opened European society for Jews as equals. For the first time since the destruction of the temple, schools, universities, the public service, politics, and the professions were open to Jews as citizens. Equality before the law and the relegation of religion to the realm of private concerns meant that the state no longer viewed itself as Christian, but as encompassing every citizen regardless of their religious beliefs or lack of them. So this is a huge, huge shift, and it comes to be one of the key elements of the modern world. This idea of secularity, secularism, the idea of not having necessarily a religion. That was not a thing before things like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the idea of you could just be a citizen and not be a part of a larger religious community.
So we're looking at France. Time-wise, so this really budded in France, right? So did it spread to the rest of Europe? How did that work?
Yeah, so, mainly I wanted to start with France because
Okay.
it's kind of like the earliest, but
Right.
also,
It started with
us being Americans, we're gonna talk about the United States as well.
right?
And it really sweeps across Central and Western Europe. And a little bit later, we're gonna talk about Eastern Europe, specifically within the Russian Empire, because things went a little differently. And that actually is really, really important to understand when it comes to the development of Zionism, because in a lot of ways, certain notions of Zionism were able to grow in a particular way in Eastern Europe, within kind of the Russian Empire and their domain, that didn't necessarily jive with what was happening in Western and Central Europe, because you have German Jews, French Jews, British Jews who are becoming fully integrated into society in a way that Eastern European Jews are not. In a lot of ways, they're sequestered. And so that's gonna be a little bit different. And it shows, why, this is so important, not only in terms of understanding the development of Zionism, but it's also really interconnected with modern Jewish denominations. So these ideas of Orthodox, conservative, reform.
And the comfort with assimilation.
Right. That's gonna be a key term that we're looking at. Whether you're talking about assimilation as a dangerous thing,
Right.
assimilation as a good
That's a
thing,
good thing, right?
which is, in a lot of ways connected with these ideas of emancipation and enlightenment of like, oh yeah, I can be fully French, I can be fully English, I can engage with the great scholars of the age in a meaningful way and participate in this larger cultural revolution that's happening. and not be excluded purely because I'm a Jew.
It's not just all Talmud anymore.
Right, it's not just all Talmud anymore, absolutely. Okay. Third key term, nationalism. Right, went to the handy dandy Encyclopedia Britannica, just for a quick and easy definition. So nationalism is ideology based on the premise that the individual's loyalty and devotion to the nation state surpasses other individual or group interests. So this idea of a nation state, of a political entity that is representative of a particular nation. Kind of a new thing. And from Gideon Shimoni in his book, The Zionist Ideology, identification with the nation is regarded as essential for the individual's freedom, well-being, and self-realization. Consciousness of common origin, whether mythic or actual, common language, religion, and territory, meaning physical territory, or at least association with the territory. So the key elements of national identity that emerge out of this idea are two or three, depending on how you understand it. One is a common language. Two is a common land, a territory. And then three, give or take, could be religion. Now, for example, in the United States, that doesn't necessarily apply. But these ideas of what makes up a national identity are these two or three things. This idea of a common language, a common history, and I think his distinction of mythic or actual is really important because when we think about, you know, the stories that bind groups of people together, you know, many of them are actual historical events that are then expanded and described. And many of them are myths and these stories that we tell to show kind of what makes us distinct as a group of people. You know, we in America have our own myths. We have Paul Bunyan, you know, scraping his axe across the world and making the Grand Canyon. We have George Washington and his cherry tree. We have, you know, all of these stories that come to be or that teach us about like what it means to be an American. And the same is true for French, German, British, Spanish, so on and so forth. And so this then becomes this question of like, okay, if you want to continue this idea of Jews' national identity, and the truth is, in order for Jews to participate in this larger cultural thing that's happening, like the good, forget what his official title was, but like the good Frenchman was saying earlier, we can accept Jews as individuals and maybe even as a religious tradition, but not as a nation, because that conflicts with it might conflict with their identification with another national identity, French, German, so on and so forth. So, but if you are still committed to the idea of Jews as a national identity, you know, most people would say there's a common language. And this is, we'll get to this a little bit next week. We're gonna talk about it a little bit here. But that's where we get this idea of the revival of Hebrew. Like this is the language that binds us all together, as opposed to the language that Jews actually spoke, whether it's Yiddish, or for Portuguese and Spanish Jews, Ladino, and a lot of Dutch Jews, of course. So you have the language, maybe, you have the religion, for sure. But you're missing one big thing that's part of this idea of national identity. That is a land.
The land.
Jews are a group of people that for a long time, didn't necessarily have particular homeland. And that's where we start getting into the trickiness of what it means to be a Jew in the modern world. What does it mean for our identities to be, on the one hand, participating in secular society, French, American, British, whatever it is, but then also being tied to a group of people with their own sense of a collective identity. As Arthur Hertzberg says in this book, The Zionist Idea, the modern Jew no longer needed to prove primarily that he had become a man of the West, but that he was indeed a participant in the mythical essence of the German, French, etc., national soul. We therefore find the leaders of German Reform Judaism asserting with every ever greater, I think it's a typo, ever greater vehemence by the 1840s that Berlin was their new Jerusalem. Quote, the fatherland to which we cling with all the bonds of love.
Oh, right.
You know, it's very strange for us to read something like that,
Right.
knowing our history and knowing eventually what happens. But we also see this in America, you know, one of the key elements of early Reform Judaism was taking away that national element of being Jewish. And I think it's really important to talk about the national soul and this really mystical essence. If people are interested, a lot of this idea of nation states and nationalism is guided by what's going on in philosophy at the time, primarily this guy named Carl Friedrich Hegel, who talks about like this mystical beauty of a nation and so on and so forth. But we don't have to get too deep into it. Any questions before we move on?
So there was no anti-Semitism and all the Frenchmen and Germans were good with all of this
Oh, sure.
incorporating the Jews.
No.
Or is that what precipitated the modern notion of Zionism later?
Yeah, so that's what we're gonna dive into next week, because this is all, you know, for the people that were experiencing this, for a lot of the people, I should say there are a lot of people that were not happy about this. In many ways, what we have as modern, for example, Orthodoxy and especially ultra-Orthodoxy was a rejection of the modern, a rejection of integrating with larger society, of dressing like larger society, speaking the same language as larger society, so on and so forth. But for a lot of people, this is a really, really exciting opportunity. I think for us still, and I think it's important to see ourselves in this history too, you know, we are all modern people, we're modern Jews. I think Phyllis mentioned my having a notebook and paper. You know, obviously it's a callback to a previous non-technological time, but like we speak English, we go to largely secular schools, we have friends and deep relationships with people that are not a part of our religious community. And so in many ways, we are the beneficiaries of these processes. And I think underlying this, the hope was that if Jews are not so secluded, if they are a part of things, then people won't hate them as much. But the reality and what ends up happening is that is not the case. And that anti-Semitism shifts from medieval Jew hatred, which is grounded in notions of deicide, to use the fancy term, but the whole notion Jews killed Jesus, Jews killed Christ, blood libel, Jews sacrifice Christian children for their various rituals, you know, blaming Jews for the bubonic plague, and so on and so forth. But it actually shifts into Jews are not actually French, not actually German. Their allegiance is to other Jews, not to our national identity. And also with this, we begin to get concepts of like race and ethnicity. And when Jews are seen as a race, as kind of like as a biological genotype, it opens it up to a different type of anti-Semitism and a different hatred of Jews. And that's what really throws a wrench into all this. And that's where we're really going to talk about that next week, because even as Jews rose the ranks, become these really, really important, you know, when we think about the 19th century, we got to remember, like, there are a lot of Jewish intellectuals that are really, really pivotal in larger political things, cultural things that are happening across Europe and in the United States, I would add. But in a certain way, for a lot of people, Jews will never fit the idea of what it means to be French or German or British, or even, I would say, we always still have this strand here, American. So that's the tension that's beginning to brew. Yeah, any other questions? Do you have a question? Okay.
I have a quick thought about,
Sure.
because, half of my family was from Eastern Europe, my father's side, but my mother's side was from Turkey. And I was just wondering, when this was all starting to happen with Zionism being discussed and everything, was that happening in Turkey amongst the Jews also?
Yeah, this is what I will admit, this is one of my blind spots in my understanding of the history of Zionism, is understanding what was happening in the Middle East and in the Islamic world at this time.
Right.
I've prepared some stuff for next week, but I hope to bring some of that in.
It would be interesting to know.
Yeah, but it's the reality, it's the reality of, when I studied Zionism when I was in Israel, is the vast majority of the really powerful thinkers and shapers of Zionism, and certainly once Zionism becomes a political movement,
Came out of Eastern Europe.
with like, you have Zionist congresses and organizations that are lobbying the Ottoman Empire or the British Empire to have land slated out for Jews, so on and so forth. It is very much kind of a European phenomenon, and that's the way I certainly learned it, because obviously this whole idea of emancipation, enlightenment, onset of modernity is not what's happening in generally like the Islamic world. So, like the Middle East, North Africa, there's just very different things that are happening, and and I think that's, in a lot of ways, that's where I think people get caught up. When you hear people saying, "Oh, Zionism is colonialism, and Zionism is racism," and it's that only fixating on the idea of like, the larger political Zionism is something that grew out of Europe, but it's certainly very different, and that's where we're kind of moving towards. But thank you for pointing that out, and I'll admit that that's kind of like something we won't be covering in depth. So then we get to this question of Jewish nationality. Like, are Jews still a nation? Can we be a nation but also be a part of other nations? And this is something that really is one of the first issues that distinguishes Reform Judaism from other forms of approaches to Judaism. So I wanted to include, this is actually really interesting. This is a stained glass from Shearith Israel congregation. And let me see if I can put it up here so y'all can see it. Depicting Moses presented the 10 Commandments to the children of Israel. It's a congregation Shearith Israel in San Francisco, California, and it was put in 1904. And you might not be able to see, but if you look carefully, it's Moses giving the 10 Commandments, so on and so forth. We see banners back there. I would imagine those are the banners of the different tribes, but in the background, it's not a depiction of Mount Sinai in the Middle East. It's actually a depiction of Yosemite Park, and specifically El Capitan, like a lot of those big national, like monuments of Northern California. And so there you see this, and I've also seen pictures of, so in many traditional synagogues, you have, in Hebrew, you call it the parochet, but it's like this curtain that covers the ark. So you have the gates to the ark, but then there's like a curtain. And there's pictures of them, and like the curtain is basically made out of an American flag. So you have this blending of American identity and Jewish identity that's happening here, and in this real deep commitment to patriotism. But part of that commitment to patriotism, and I think it's important for us to recognize as Reformed Jews, was giving up this idea of Jews as a we would say a people, but really Jews as a nation. Yeah, you want to?
Yeah, sometimes I feel like an expatriate, but at any rate, I pointed out 1904 in San Francisco, you said? So that's right after the great earthquake. So the original synagogue must have burned down.
Yeah.
And they replaced, this was a replacement for the one that burned down.
Yeah, and so included here, I have a resolution from the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Now we refer to it as the Union for Reform Judaism, from 1898, and this is following the first Pittsburgh Platform in 1885. And this makes things very clear about where the Reform movement was. We are unalterably opposed to political Zionism. The Jews are not a nation, but a religious community. Zion was a precious possession of the past. As such, it is a holy memory, but it is not our hope of the future. America is our Zion. Here in the home of religious liberty, we have aided in founding this new Zion, the fruition of the beginning laid in the old. Again, the beginning laid in the old, Tel Aviv, Old New Land. The mission of Judaism is spiritual, not political. Its aim is not to establish a state, but to spread the truths of religion and humanity throughout the world. Now, I'm not here to like condemn Reform Judaism. Obviously. But I think it's important for us to recognize that many of the leading figures in Reform Judaism, including one Isaac Mayer Wise, who's like the founding father of American Reform Judaism, was very opposed to Zionism in these early beginnings. Now,
But that's where they were back then. That's
right,
what it-
and but things shift.
Right.
Things shift very
Right.
dramatically. But when we look at, and part of me teaching this class is it helps us understand the way that the state of Israel looks now. And when we look at how Reform Judaism is very much like a minor facet of the religious landscape of Israeli Judaism, I think part of the reason is because of this clash in this early rejection of Zionism on the part of Reform Jews. And in many ways, when we look at the growth of Zionism and the growth of Reform Judaism, both of them are responses to the modern world. The Reform approach was, we want to participate in society. We want to become modern people. We want to get secular education. And we want to adopt the ideas of the Enlightenment. We want to have a rational interpretation of our sacred texts. We want to reform our worship and our liturgy so that it's more modern and aesthetically pleasing to a modern person. And Zionism is a very different thing because it's latching on to that notion of nation. Now, you might be a secular person, but your allegiance at the end of the day may or may not be to kind of like this Jewish identity. So we have a lot of secular Zionists, and then of course there are religious Zionists, and we're going to be getting into that in a little bit. Now, we got just over 5 minutes left. It's a lot to cover. But this is good to know. So now there was a limit. This idea of emancipation, modernity, citizenship, all these things are happening in France, in Germany, in Austria, in England, of course, in the United States, which is kind of its own thing, but it is not happening in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, around that same time, around 1791, we have the establishment of what is referred to as the Pale of Settlement. And that is this huge territory here. And those of you here in the room will point out, so here we have Russia, Moscow. So this is what is now modern day Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, Ukraine, and then, like down here. So that's a part of Ukraine. Here we have the Crimean Peninsula, obviously a part of the world that has, that we've been focusing on a lot.
Yeah.
And this is this huge swath of territory where Jews are allowed to live. They're not allowed to come into Russia proper,
Right.
but they can stay there, and the movement was restricted. And so I give like a definition of what the Pale of Settlement is, but not that important. And so, as part of the Russian Empire, Jews are able to, in many ways, preserve their national identity. And even up until the 1910s, 20s, post the Soviet Revolution, when you had if you had a Russian passport or Russian documentation, when it would list nationality, it would say Jewish.
Ah.
So all of that to say, Jews were not welcomed into modern society in the same way that they were elsewhere. They were still sectioned off. There, a little bit later, there were some efforts to bring Jews into universities, into the army, and acculturate them into, and I think that's an important word, acculturation, assimilation. Assimilation, generally used as a negative term, meaning that we just blend in with the rest of society, we lose our sense of distinction as a people. Acculturation means that we use the trappings of our society, but maintain our identity. And I think acculturation is a more appropriate term for certainly us as American Reform Jews. But these things aren't happening. So as we'll see, a lot of the really important philosophical foundational thinkers of Zionism generally come from the Pale of Settlement, generally come from Eastern Europe and from an area of the world that, in a lot of ways, many of us can draw our ancestors back to. And also really importantly, when we get to around the turn of the 20th century, you have a lot of Jews that are from the Pale of Settlement that start making their way here. And they're bringing with them many different ideas. And that was actually a big kind of shock and conflict, an intra-Jewish conflict, where you have many, which were primarily Central and Western European Jews. So we mostly think of German Jews. They were the major immigration around, we usually point to like between 1845 and 1850, or 1855, around when this wonderful congregation was founded. They're the ones who largely brought Reform Judaism. But also there were French Jews. My student pulpit in rabbinical school was in Lafayette, Louisiana, and that congregation was founded by French Jews. But they are coming in as full members of society. And then when you get the wave of Eastern European Jews, it's very different. It's very different. And I went to rabbinical school in Cincinnati. For a long time, there were two Jewish country clubs in Cincinnati. One was for the German Jews, one was for the Eastern European Jews. And so even as we, talk about Jewish unity, there is a lot of conflict that happens there. And so things go a little bit differently. And here we have Avineri saying, it is then not surprising that the first attempt to write a modern, secular, yet biblical historical novel in Hebrew emerged in Lithuania in the mid-19th century out of this dilemma of identity and cross-currents of contending nationalisms. If Poles and Lithuanians could delve into their history and form their own modern national identity on the anvil of the past, why could the Jews not follow this modern and liberating example? And this is where we get those real first sparks of what comes to be known as Zionism, or modern Zionism. Now, the wrench in the wheel of progress, as we already talked about a little bit, is anti-Semitism, is the continued treatment of Jews as the other. On the right here, we have a newspaper article depicting the Dreyfus Affair, which we'll be talking about a little bit, and obviously the Dreyfus Affair, really, really impactful for Theodore Herzl, but it's a good encapsulation of why it's not all rainbows and sunshine with Jews entering into the modern world. And here we have Leon Pinsker, one of the foundational thinkers of Zionism, who comes in, and this is very much in contrast to those early things we see either from the UAHC talking about America as our Zion, or even earlier, the French articulation of, France is our Zion. He says in 1882, the Jewish people has no fatherland of its own, though many motherlands. Jews are home everywhere, but are nowhere at home. To the living, the Jew is a corpse. To the native, a foreigner. To the homesteader, a vagrant. To the proprietary, a beggar. To the poor, an exploiter and a millionaire. To the patriot, a man without a country, for all a hated rival.
It's at the beginning of anti-Semitism.
Well.
The beginning?
No.
Not the beginning.
But this is,
No, it's just been rolling along.
this is a perfect encapsulation of what the modern version of anti-Semitism looks like, which is that we are apart but distinct. And in so many ways, this is kind of the anti-Semitism we continue to see today. And this is a huge foundational force in creating Zionism. So in summary, we talked about emancipation, talked about enlightenment, talked about nationalism, good refresher on your AP European history. And I wanted to end with this quote: Zionism was the most fundamental revolution in Jewish life in the 19th and 20th centuries. It substituted a secular self-identity of the Jews as a nation for the traditional and orthodox self-identity in religious terms. It changed a passive, quietistic, and pious hope of the return to Zion into an effective social force, moving millions of people to Israel. It transformed a language relegated to mere religious usage into a modern secular motor of intercourse, of the nation state. I think that might be a secular modern, or typo, my mistake. Of a nation state. Zionism is not just a reaction of people to persecution. It is the quest for self-determination and liberation under the modern conditions of secularization and liberalism. And so that's why it's a good encapsulation of what we just talked about. And it was why I started our class not with the biblical promise of the land, but with the onset of modernity, because I very much agree with Rabbi. He's way smarter and way more learned than I am. But as he points out, and the reality is, while we would always pray towards Jerusalem 3 times a day, we would say next year in Jerusalem in our seders, it was very much a mythic return to Jerusalem. With modern Zionism, it's a very tangible, real movement to not create, but maybe recreate, refurbish, however you want to see it, a national identity that is distinctive to the Jewish people, and that eventually leads to the creation of a Jewish nation state, the state of Medinat Israel, the state of Israel. And so we'll pick up from there next week. See you next week. But thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Great class.
And feel free to, so I'll send out the slides, send out the Zoom recording, but feel free to reach out to me if you have questions or are interested in resources. So really appreciate all of you being here and your willingness to learn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your evening. Thank you to everyone joining us on Zoom.
You too.
Sorry I didn't get a chance to field some questions from y'all. Just trying to manage here, but thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you next week.